I was probably being too focused on, teaching thinking as breaking with tradition and getting people to think for themselves, albeit in groups. And of course, I came to realize that the standard objection that in order to think, you have to think about something, you can't just teach thinking in a vacuum, was a pretty good one. And what you're thinking about, of course, is the tradition that you're being inducted into, but you have to learn to question, challenge, and develop that in order for it to be a living tradition, but more importantly, in order for you to feel like a participant so that you can own the tradition. You're not just having it imposed on you.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
So we're here today to discuss the book by Rupert Wegerif, Rethinking Educational Theory, Education as Expanding Dialogue. David, why should anybody read this book?
Because it's so timely. It makes the case for collectivism in education better than anything I've read recently. We desperately need that. We've had utility and individualization foisted on us for so long that anything that comes out and makes the case so richly for dialogue, collectivism, debate, working together and teaching each other has to be read.
Rupert Wegerif, welcome to the Rethinking Education podcast.
Oh, welcome.
And welcome from me. And welcome from me too.
Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, likewise. This is a conversation that I think we've sort of talked about it on and off over the years. I've wanted to have this conversation for a long time, and the publication of your recent super interesting book, Rethinking Educational Theory, Education as Expanding Dialogue, prompted David and I to shunt it up the to-do list and to get it into the calendar. So it's great to have you with us. We're going to spend most of the time talking about the book and the ideas in it and the ideas that may well spin out of it. But before we do that, I'm really interested to hear from to hear about the roots of this work. So you mentioned in the book that you were a teacher. So were you a particularly dialogic teacher? Like at what point did this interest in dialogue start to take root for you?
Yeah, I feel slightly embarrassed about that because I did the teacher training for 1 year at Bristol as a religious education teacher, secondary. But I then went straight on to do a master's in computing and a PhD in ed tech. So I don't think I fully qualified because you're supposed to do at least a year, aren't you?
Oh, okay.
So you know what it's like if you're doing a PGCE, you do spend a lot of time in classrooms and it's pretty intense and memorable. So, and then of course, as you know, I did a PhD partly with Neil Mercer. It was one of my supervisors. So although I was then, and we spent a lot of time in schools, in primary schools, and I did a lot of research following that with Neil Mercer in the Open University in primary schools. So, I feel like I can just about say I've been a teacher. What do you think?
Yes, I think you squeak in. You spent some time. You've taught some lessons. You've spent some time, and like you say, it is a very memorable, quite an intense experience, isn't it? Even if you only do it for a few months.
Yes, well, you have to spend a lot of time quite rightly, in schools and in classrooms to qualify or to do the PGCE. So, funnily enough, we employed someone here at Cambridge who was in one of my classrooms studying RE. He's now the head of RE here.
Oh, really? One of your students?
Yeah, he was 12. He remembered me and he remembered the lesson in great detail. So I must have been pretty good.
And so I know that. So you mentioned there that you did a master's in computer science, was it?
Yeah, it was a conversion at Queen Mary Westfield.
And I know that your work still straddles that. I know that you're still very interested in computing and AI and what have you. And I think we're going to get into that shortly. So what was it? So you said that it sort of came out of the interesting dialogue came out of your like conversations with Neil Mercer around was it one of those situations where you sort of sign up to do a PhD and then you go on a bit of a journey of exploration and to think about what it is that you're going to focus on?
Yeah, well, actually, I signed up at the Institute of Education Technology, working with Dr. Pat Fung in the lab of Tim O'Shea, Eileen Scanlon, very much leading in education technology at the time. And then I read a little book called Common Knowledge by Derek Edwards, Neil Mercer. It was a lot about classroom talk. And I found it really, really struck home how through dialogue, children could convert their procedural knowledge to conceptual knowledge in the classroom. And that was really connected more with my interests, I felt, than they were actually doing AI at the time in the lab, and there were lots of these big, complicated, intelligent tutoring systems being developed, but they could never be used in schools because I had spent some time in classrooms and I knew, what it was like, and this didn't seem to be that relevant. Whereas what Neil Mercer was doing in the School of Education was far closer to my interest. So I combined the two, and I worked with Neil to get children to talk around computers. That's really what I did for my PhD.
Yeah. Was that the
But
slant study?
yeah, so he plugged me into a project that was already going on where they had many hours of videos of children in a range of schools talking around computers, because at that time, there weren't that many computers, and teachers used them to support communication and get groups talking around them.
Yes, yeah, indeed. So that was the slant was spoken language and new technologies or something, wasn't it? It stood for. And
Yes.
so, yes. Okay. Do you know what? It might actually be worth just spending a bit of time on that because it is an origin story, but it also underpins so much of the work that you and Neil have gone on to do since then, and that's influenced my own work. And so, I think it might be helpful for our listeners and viewers just to hear a bit about that slant study, and if you could lead that into the discernment of around different types of talk, disputational and exploratory talk, and so on, that would be really helpful.
Yes, well, people had been collecting, I think, about 50 hours of video of small groups of children talking around computers in mostly primary, but also secondary classrooms. And the analysis showed when they obviously were working collaboratively with teachers, and when you showed teachers the videos, they were often a little bit disappointed because their idea was you put children in groups in order to develop their communication skills, but obviously they were busy and looking elsewhere. And quite often the quality of the talk wasn't impressive. Somebody would seize control or they'd be chatting about what they saw on TV. And so that kind of led to within the project, the development of a program to teach what was called exploratory talk, following Douglas Barnes's work on exploratory talk that had preceded that. So there'd been a lot of interest in classroom talk. And that's really that was kind of where my PhD came in. I worked with Lynn Dawes in her classroom. So she'd been a primary teacher for many years. And we developed a program called Thinking Together to teach exploratory talk. And my PhD was to essentially, in a sense, evaluate it, but more importantly, to demonstrate, to explore how you could teach children to think together better by teaching them to talk together better. I introduced the exciting idea of bringing in Raven's nonverbal reasoning tests. And I don't know if I remember there was some consternation at the time because people weren't always very keen on a test that was a core part of the IQ tests.
Yeah, that's what. So I thought Raven's matrices. It's basically IQ type questions.
Yeah, it's the nonverbal part of IQ test, more or less.
Right.
But of course, they're just puzzles. I personally like doing those kind of puzzles, and so we're working with children aged about 9 and 10, year 5, and they loved it. Of course, because when they're talking together, we could actually, hard to stop them doing it in the break. But that was my evaluation, because that was interesting, because in a sense, then it's an experiment to test Vygotsky's claim that our ability to think, higher mental functions, is the internalization of social relations. It's everything that's internal in higher order thinking, more or less. He talked about the higher mental functions. I don't suppose he was referring to all thinking, but basically what we think of as thinking when we're talking about teaching thinking originates in social interactions and relations. So we were just teaching ground rules for talk, ways of talking together. And I could show that this then improved measurably, not only how well the groups could solve these problems, but also individuals. We got something like 10% in my PhD study. We then repeated this, we got funding. So I think that was quite innovative and interesting.
I'm just fascinated, Rupert, about the timing of this, because this whole conversation that we're having just now seems to me to be very closely linked with the current rise of oracy in educational debate. So we've got oracy as a major element in the Francis Review, and James and I did a podcast with a couple of the people who were on the review group. I wonder if you maybe say a bit more about the relationship of your work and the work that you've done around talk in this way and the current interest in oracy.
Yeah, I was thinking about that with this idea of where did I become interested in dialogue? Because my recollection is at the time with Neil in discussions and the group, there was a Centre for Language and Communication. We were mostly interested in dialogue and dialogic theory. There was a lot of Bakhtin, James Virch, I don't know if you remember him, but he'd written about Bakhtin and Vygotsky. I don't remember us talking about oracy very much. Although having said that, it was often, about classroom talk. A lot of talk was involved, not oracy, but talk. And of course, Douglas Barnes's work from communication to curriculum was all about exploratory talk. So what I'm trying to say is it's interesting how it then sort of polarized a bit and became focused on oracy, Neil's work at least. And I'm part of the oracy group now in Cambridge with James Mannion as other luminaries. And I think that's interesting. And I think it was a bit political because actually I was interested in, and I think others were as well, of course, in improving the quality of thinking and learning. I'd had a background of trying to teach thinking. My first degree was philosophy. And so I naturally wanted to teach thinking somehow, it seemed a good idea. But why did it become oracy? Well, because of the simplicity and clarity of it. You've got literacy, you've got numeracy. We had a literacy strategy, we had a numeracy strategy, we got oracy. But of course, oracy is about the medium. It's about speaking and listening, and it can be used in different ways. And dialogue is only one way of using it. It could also be used for show and tell, for presentations and all that sort of thing, which is a good idea, of course. But it's not quite the same as dialogue. And the real reason why oracy is valuable for me is the dialogic element, because it's always just a medium. And you can, of course, have dialogue through writing, for example, through video, through dance, through music. You can have dialogue in lots of ways where there's a clash of different perspectives and there's a sort of shared inquiry and learning together. But I think that it's through spoken language that people first learn to think. They first have to justify themselves and explain themselves to others and collaborate. And so, that's probably the best medium for teaching thinking.
And I think that's really helpful and also timely. And can I say, Rupert, that I found your book as a whole incredibly timely. I think one of the things that you do remarkably well in the book, sorry, that sounded astonishingly patronizing, but that your end of term report, Rupert, did remarkably well. But you really, I think, chart between points. So I think the book's extremely helpful in terms of navigating between traditional approaches progressive approaches, you have a real command of influences and references. And you're very good at making links across and between these references. And at one point, when I was reading the book, I thought that was its great strength, that it wasn't so much rethinking towards new ideas, but rethinking towards a synthesis, which was a kind of almost a kind of Hegelian thing, which I was very impressed by. So the book's marvelous, I think, in that regard. And one of the things that I find a real masterstroke in it is when you wrestle with the idea of education as a means of conveying culture, and you talk about that as a key function of education, is to convey the existing culture. It's part of the whole outside inside element that runs right through the book. But you have this brilliant idea of culture as a living tradition. So it's not passing on the kind of dead hand of history, if you like. It's an engagement with what has gone before, but in a kind of constructive way. Is that a fair interpretation of what you've done in the book, or am I missing points?
No, I'm very pleased that it connected with you in that way. I certainly, what I was trying to communicate, but obviously it's something I've been thinking about and struggling with over the years, because it's been such an issue in the education community that there's been a bit of a division. I think, I think they use the shorthand on social media between the trads and the progs, and there was a bit of the dividing of the ways. And so I was certainly exploring and thinking about this. And I did realize that early on, I think it was a feature of the time and my own background in education, that I was probably being too focused on, teaching thinking as breaking with tradition and getting people to think for themselves, albeit in groups. And of course, I came to realize that the standard objection that in order to think, you have to think about something, you can't just teach thinking in a vacuum, was a pretty good one. And what you're thinking about, of course, is the tradition that you're being inducted into, but you have to learn to question, challenge, and develop that in order for it to be a living tradition, but more importantly, in order for you to feel like a participant so that you can own the tradition. You're not just having it imposed on you. Obviously, I was influenced there by reading Paulo Freire, who makes a very good point that a lot of education is taking, as it were, well, I mean, to simplify and summarize, you're taking the discourse of the rich and you're imposing it on the minds of the poor without them actually participating in the culture. They just have to reproduce what they're told. And this is a way of oppressing people rather than liberating them. I think that's a very good point, and you see it all the time. But it also connects with Michael Oakeshott's views. I don't know if you come across that, the conversation of mankind. Michael Oakeshott is often quoted by conservatives as a conservative political theorist, but his educational stuff is very dialogic and actually, I think, connects perfectly with Freire, because he talks about, okay, people have an inheritance of culture, but you can't just give it to them. You have to, he calls it conversational encounters. You have to induct them into what he sees as an ongoing conversation that began in the distant past and in his global. And I think so. I was inspired by that vision of education, really. It's a living tradition because it's a kind of dialogue. It's a long-term dialogue of culture. And you can't just learn a dialogue, you have to learn how to participate in it. In other words, there are always different perspectives. You can always locate yourself in relation to what other people are saying, but you have to learn how to do that. It's a process, it's not just a product.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that I loved about the book was the idea that what you're trying to do, I think, is to encourage critical engagement. You haven't gone to the truly left point of challenge, and you haven't gone with the right wing view of acceptance, and you've reached this point of encouraging and enabling critical engagement with all that is taught. So there's the conveying of knowledge, there's the conveying of information, but the capacity for critical engagement at the same time. And again, does that seem like a reasonable summary of what you're doing in the book?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I guess I don't, I mean, I don't personally, I don't completely see it as a synthesis. I mean, I'd like to think that it's an element of rethinking, because it seems to me that that in a way, this polarization was based on a bit of a misunderstanding. On the one hand, you have these, child-centered approaches, which were very real, weren't they? Had that sort of teacher, leave them kids alone, this idea that children can just kind of learn on their own somehow, which at its extreme is a bit, well, a bit odd. And on the other hand, you have the idea of just transmitting traditions and everyone facing the front and taking notes off the board, which again would be very, very extreme caricatures, sort of grad grind, teaching kids facts, things. But that's kind of a misunderstanding, because in reality, you always have to have both, don't you? You have to have a dialogue. Unless children don't learn, unless they have some sort of answering questions, unless some sort of participation. So even if you're giving a lecture from the front, you won't learn anything unless people can participate, at least vicariously. And these traditions are never fixed and closed. It's always necessary in any area. I mean, say you're learning how to make bread. It's a good idea to be able to understand the principles so you can question it, challenge it. Maybe you could learn how people make bread in other parts of the world. Whatever you're doing, the tradition requires some kind of constructive, critical participation in order for it to kind of keep going. So it just felt like a misunderstanding. So what I kind of argued, and partly influenced, of course, by Neil Mercer, who made the same sort of arguments, is that it's not about teacher-centered or student-centered. I would argue it's dialogue-centered, that the dialogue, the knowledge isn't a thing, it's a dialogue. And we want to focus on that dialogue. We don't just want to teach kids what they want to learn already. That would be kind of dangerous and scary. And we don't just want to teach them what the tradition says. We want to induct them into participation in culture as a dialogue that they're part of.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with what you're saying. I mean, the book, for me, the more I thought about it, goes far beyond any synthesis. What I would describe it as is a dynamic synthesis. So you bring together the ideas, but create momentum towards a genuine rethinking, and hence the title of the book.
Well, by the way, it was given to me. The editor wanted Rethinking Education, so I put in the, but I wasn't trying to steal your title from your podcast.
Well, it's a fine title, so we're happy for people to share it, promiscuous like that. And so on the title thing, so the strapline, so the book is Rethinking Educational Theory, and the strapline is Education as Expanding Dialogue. Why expanding?
I always like this idea of expansive learning, haven't you? Well, I suppose why expanding? Interesting question. I actually think about the idea of Freire of expanding consciousness, of conscientization or mind expanding. I think it's very real. I know it got a few, got a big kickback, that sort of idea. It was big in the 60s, old enough to remember that, although I was a kid at the time. But the point is that as you learn new things, you're not just piling up facts, you're learning to think about the world in new ways. Particular model I had was the idea that if you think about it dialogically, in every dialogue you have with somebody, if you understand their lives, if you understand how they see the world, that in a sense becomes part of your repertoire. And so over time, there is an expansion in the number of perspectives you can bring to bear to understand anything. I was actually quite influenced by just listening to a little talk by Michael Moore Purgo, the children's author, and he was just on the radio. And he said something like, when you come across wise people, they've usually read a lot, because you need to be able to bring a range of perspectives to bear in order to have a wise understanding. Well, that's very true, and that's about expanding the space of dialogue. So it's not a physical space. It's not just the number of voices. It's the number of perspectives in constructive relationship that you can apply. Doesn't that make sense to you? Does it work for you, expanding?
I think it does and it doesn't. I think that in a sense, yes, of course, like yeah, mind expanding, and
Yeah.
as people learn, yeah, as you read, as you grow, as you take in more perspectives, as you say, and you're essentially talking about an expansion of mind. I suppose that like things can get bigger without getting better. I suppose you could spend a lot of time filling your mind with nonsense that you read on the internet, for example, and there seems to be a lot of that. There's a lot of that about people are believing things that aren't necessarily true, and they're not really engaging in a dialogue with that information. They're just sort of, so in a sense their mind is expanding, but it's not, it's like it's not like an inherently good thing. It feels like there perhaps needs to be some other kind of qualifier, like it's expanding and also enriching, or it's expanding and also developing a more sort of accurate map of reality or something. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, if you focus in on the small, I mean, this was the title, right? I didn't have a lot of space, but whenever I
No,
present,
paragraph is the strapline.
yeah, whenever I present this in the rest of the book, I think I usually say, opening a space, widening the space, and deepening the space, which I think answers what you're saying. So on the one hand, it's bring a range of perspectives to bear, but in order to make sense of that range of different perspectives, you usually find you have to question the frame you're using, question the assumptions, and deepen them. So I do think it is ultimately an expansion, but it's not an expansion of a number of points on a line. It's about a deepening. It's kind of logical space, really, isn't it? From the way I'm describing it, but I'm trying to perhaps I'm not.
Yeah. Well, let's just alight on that briefly, and then I'll hand back over to you, David, about this idea of a dialogic space. Like, what is that, right? And so there's a really interesting bit on, like, literally on page 1, on chapter 1, where you sort of say, "I hope this makes sense to you, dear reader. Pause for a while to consider what is happening when you read these signs, like these squidgies on a page." How are these patterns of external marks on a page or screen in front of you connecting with patterns in your experience, connecting with your answering words, perhaps, to form a new internal space of meaning? Where is this place, this space where we meet? What is it exactly? So I'm going to turn that question back on you, because that I had to put the book down and have about a few days to think about that paragraph when I came across it, because it's like, well, yes, right. What is this
I'm
space? It's
glad
not
I'm
on the
glad you
page.
noticed that.
It's not
Yeah.
solely in my head either.
Yeah, I'm glad you noticed that because it does touch on deep and profound and complex. Basically, I think as a result of probably of our schooling, we are inducted into this weird idea that we're a little physically located and physically limited. I mean, I'm talking to you and I've no idea where you are in the world through this amazing medium of Zoom. How is that even possible? When I read a book, say it's a book by, I don't know, by Plato or something, how can I actually communicate with somebody thousands of years ago? And then, I'm if you're well, okay, I'm very inspired by the French phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty, and he just like explored where does meaning come from in perception. And if you just like have a moment, it's now, it's here, and it's now. It's also necessarily everywhere and forever, because where is now except it's the concretization, as it were, of the whole of time, and where is here? It's an expression of the whole of space. So, in other words, where do we exist? We exist everywhere and forever at any moment. This whole idea that we are trapped inside some sort of little box is something that we have constructed, particularly in this culture, particularly through formal education. And it's basically a destructive illusion. So, what I'm trying to do with this dialogic theory is open people up to the fact that they are already, that meaning, the real space of meaning is a dialogic space. And it's only out of that and within that that we construct these limits that we have. And so I'm trying to open that. I feel so. In other words, a difference. Say there's a difference between you and me, or a difference between black and white. That is actually that difference opens up onto the original infinite design space out of which we construct this apparent fixed world. And when you experience that in reading and writing, just think about the space where you are making meaning out of these little black marks. It's extraordinary. And it's reactivating a space which is bigger than you, because you yourself and your image of yourself as the reader is something that's constructed within I don't know, I'm getting carried away here, but it's a deep and profound and complicated issue. But it is really, to some extent, what I'm trying to say. So I'm glad you noticed it. It's a kind of, do you think that was a useful response? Or?
I do think it was a useful response. I want to pick up some of these ideas later on, but I'm gonna hand over to David for now.
Let's rethink education.
Hello, friends. This podcast is brought to you by the wonderful people at Crown House Publishing. And before we dive into today's conversation, I would just like to draw your attention to an absolute belter of a book that's just been published called Calm Leadership. My camera is a little bit blurry there. Calm Leadership, Staying Grounded, Staying in Control, and Staying the Course by Patrick Cozier, which was described by none other than David Lammy, who's like the Deputy Prime Minister, is he? He was Foreign Secretary until recently, Secretary of State for Justice, who wrote that this is both an inspiring reflection on overcoming the challenges of leadership and a practical guide to harnessing the power of emotional intelligence in the workplace. Since taking on the role of school leader in 2006, and as one of the few Black school leaders in the UK at the time, Patrick has navigated through the complexities of school leadership and has learned to do so calmly. At the heart of this book is Patrick's calm leadership model, shaped over many years of practice, which includes confronting uncalm feelings, adapting to the feeling of leadership, leading people with humanity and understanding, and maturing into the leader you are meant to be. This is an absolute doozy of a book, and I heartily commend it to you.
Let's rethink education.
No, I think you illustrate something that's profoundly interesting about the book. And that is that it's profoundly philosophical. And the kind of discussion that you were getting into there. But I think that's one of the strengths of the book, that it is metaphysical in lots of ways, and it's profoundly philosophical, as I said earlier, but also you keep coming back to practical illustrations. You talk about work in classrooms that you've been involved in, and so on and so forth. And you have this idea of what you talk about as double dialogue in the classroom. And you introduced that idea to explain how direct teaching and dialogical education can coexist. Can you unpack that a bit for us? Because I think a lot of people will want to get into what does this mean for me as a practitioner in a classroom?
Yes, thanks. No, I think that is quite a profound and useful idea that comes from the literature on dialogic theory. People like Per Linnell from Linköping in Sweden did a book on that, pointed out that dialogue is always double dialogue, as well as, say I'm talking to someone in a classroom, so there's a small group of kids are talking in a classroom about history. They're in dialogue with each other, but they're also in dialogue with the tradition of history or of mathematics, if they're talking about mathematics. So the double dialogic is the idea that there's a context of a cultural tradition which is also being referred to, being addressed, being rethought. And so you're in dialogue with that at the same time as you're in dialogue with specific people. So if you just think about the small group of children like we did with Thinking Together, and obviously dialogic education isn't just about small groups, also, with whole large groups with the teacher and so on. but it's not just about that dialogue. That dialogue is always situated in a dialogue with a longer term cultural dialogue. For example, a discipline like science or mathematics or history. Does that make sense, or does it need more unpacking? But that's why it's not just about teaching thinking in isolation. It's about teaching how to ask questions, to listen deeply, in the context of joining a long-term cultural dialogue about, well, stuff like history or science or maths or citizenship or whatever.
Yeah, I was certainly more comfortable in many ways with your approach to this than I don't know if you're familiar with Martin Robinson's book Trivium,
Yes,
and yeah,
yes,
and he he's almost sequential in the way that he thinks. You do the grammar and then you do the rhetoric and then you move on, whereas you seem to be much more dynamic, that things happen simultaneously, that it's possible both to impart and engage. It's possible to learn and to establish the capacity for critique. And I wonder if you might say a bit more about that Thinking Together program. I think people would find it interesting to hear about that, if you like, dialogic education in action to some extent. So a bit more about Thinking Together, Rupert.
yeah. Well, I say I think Lynn Dawes was very much the prime mover in developing a set of lessons, as it were, for us to get children talking together. But the basic idea is one of making young people at every age, come to think of it, aware of the impact of how they talk together, and then helping them, usually, through to some extent getting them to share ground rules and ideas that they think would make for effective dialogue. So we're not just imposing it, but to some extent inducting it from them to think, well, what would be most effective ground rules, basically social norms, expectations for how to work together, and then trying that out. First of all, certainly on some activities that are independent of the curriculum, but then applying that in every curriculum area. So we tended to get people in talking groups, small groups of 3, and it's about not exactly rocket science. What would be a good way of discussing and talking about issues? Things like giving reasons, not getting angry when you're challenged, but actually thinking about it and exploring alternatives. And crucially, I think asking everyone in the small group, what do you think? Why do you think that? And getting people to agree before they move on, which is, can be challenged, but in practice, when I was dealing with people with one mouse and a computer, you had to agree before you clicked. And then that approach was discussing things and exploring alternatives and finding the best answer was then applied. We did it for, I got some funding with Neil, ESRC and others, I think Karen Littleton. We did ESRC and Nuffield to explore it in maths and science, and indeed in citizenship with Esme Fairburn, I think that was. So I was working as a research fellow for a few years to show that this approach, it isn't just about teaching thinking. With the Ravens reasoning tests, I argued this is a very effective way of teaching thinking. It was also about developing conceptual understanding in different areas of the curriculum, such that we could measure the impact on standardized tests. We did it for maths and science, and it seemed very effective. Was that
Good.
answering?
Yeah, no, that's enormously helpful, I think.
But
James.
in general, it's a very good approach. I think it's been widely used. We tried it in Mexico, we tried it in different countries, even in China. Sometimes the ground rules are a little bit different. In China, it was a bit different, but it still worked in exactly the same way. And if we did the evaluation, for example, with the nonverbal reasoning tests, it still gets a result.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So would you mind to just to like summarize? You sort of touched upon it there, but like some of the findings of this Thinking Together program, and I know that like you mentioned a number of different studies. Like, what were some of the findings when you teach children and young people to speak together in these more, how would you describe it, more sort of pro-social, more effective if you like, just more effective conversations. Because I think that every teacher will recognize that group work often doesn't go well, particularly if you just like leave the kids to their own devices. Like you said earlier, they're talking about what they saw on TV last night, or they're just talking off task, or like you say, one person takes the lead, or whatever it might be, or they're just arguing and bickering and so on. So when you use ground rules in this way to teach kids how to think and reason and discuss things together more effectively, what happens? What are some of the outcomes that you have found through your research?
One of the most interesting, I did actually do a whole series of CPD with the National Union of Teachers, where I got teachers to go away and try it and come back and report on it. And I noticed that almost universal finding was that the behavior improves. And we hadn't really featured that for that. We hadn't really evaluated, and we haven't even written a paper on it, although I think it's important. And I think the reason is that, of course, in the traditional classroom before our wonderful thinking together approach, if there's a problem, you tend to put your hand up and say, please, miss, or whatever, he stole my ruler or something. Whereas now, the children were sorting problems out for themselves. They were becoming more mature. And so I do think there's an identity change associated with it. I don't think that's exaggerating. It is about taking some responsibility for sorting things out together. So you're no longer just one. In a way, the idea is that the successful groups, and I evaluated this a lot, looked at a lot of videos. They're no longer just individuals, in a sense, competing together, or maybe they just agree with each other. They actually have a kind of double identity where you're a voice in the dialogue, but you also identify with the dialogue itself. Or you could say you're identify with the truth. You're trying to solve a problem. You're trying to get it right. And therefore, you're able to change your mind. You're able to question yourself. You're able to value what other people are saying. You're able to humbly ask, well, can you explain? Because that sounded interesting. Because you've in a sense, you're not only talking, you're listening to yourself talk. You can move up to take a witness position to yourself. And this generally improves behavior and improves thinking. But I think it's a bit of a shift in identity.
That's certainly the phenomenon that I've noticed. It was the most powerful thing that I ever did as a teacher by far, was coming across Neil's work and then starting to put these ideas into action and just transforming the nature of not just conversations. It is about identity, like something about spoken language that's really interesting. Like, it's often described as a skill, isn't it? Speaking and listening skills. But it's so much more than that. Like, a skill would be something like, how to do a bunny hop or whatever you call it on a skateboard or something. It's like a thing that you can just practice and gain mastery at over time, or how to, make a nice souffle or something. But it's much more transformational than that. Like, it changes you when you develop the ability to communicate effectively. The main thing I think that happens is confidence that starts to just blossom. Like, there's something about spoken language that just changes people's sense of themselves. Their limiting self-beliefs start to sort of melt away often, and it changes their ideas about what they might go on to do in the future. And that confidence can spill over into all kinds of different areas of their life. And so I think you're right to point to identity. It's quite a deep rooted thing, isn't it? It's not just like, if you teach them how to do this, their math results go up, although that does happen as well, if it's done well. But it goes deep, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so in order just to understand, if I had all these videos of small groups solving non-verbal reasoning tests. We did some other ones, mainly Ravens. And you think that's a very limited context, but just by looking at that, you can see the process that's going on is a shift in identity and an expansion of consciousness, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said that, because having David having heroically steered this conversation back into like tangible classroom stuff, I'm gonna veer it
Yeah.
veer it now back into some deep philosophical waters, because there is something that's really interesting, I think, in this book, and also in the just that I've thought about for engaging with your work over the years. And so in the book you talk about three levels of thinking about this word dialogic. What do we mean by dialogic? And the first one is like the dictionary definition, which is that, of or relating to dialogue, or whatever it is, that sort of like surface level thing. The second level is epistemological, about knowledge, and you talk about the way that knowledge is sort of surfaced and resurfaced through dialogue. And you talk about, for example, you refer to one of the Socratic dialogues a few times in the book, and you sort of say that people are publishing new interpretations of this every year. And so there's something about just being in dialogue with this text can sort of bring up, can generate new knowledge and can challenge new knowledge. And that's already super interesting. But I think that the third level that you talk about is just mind-blowing to me. And this is the ontological level, right? Ontology being about the fundamental, like the nature of being, as it were. And you identify a few like, three dimensions of this. One of them, this is I know I'm quoting your work back to you here, but maybe to refresh your memory, but also for the benefit of listeners and viewers. The first one is the self as a dialogic author, right? Just like this connects to what you were just talking about identity. You gave the example of Dostoevsky, like telling a story by weaving together many voices, and there's some sort of authorial voice that can take root in dialogue. The second one is about dialogic education as an engine of social justice. You mentioned Paulo Freire earlier, and like empowering people who are oppressed and marginalized through giving them a voice, metaphorically and physically developing their voice. And then the third one, which is just super interesting, which sort of you say that it accepts these two visions about being a dialogic author and about social justice, but it goes further to think about that we're changing ourselves. And going back to what you said a bit about earlier about how everything's super interconnected, we're also changing reality itself, right?
Yeah, and I struggled with that because I thought, what are people going to make about that? And
I love it.
I don't think I can
Do you mind
reasonably.
if I just finish my
Sorry,
my train of thought? No, please dive in 1 second. So
Yeah.
you then link it to this Buddhist idea of nirvana, and about being on a. There's something here about the, you mentioned it already earlier about this illusion of separation that we have, that we're taught that we are sort of individuals, and it does look like I'm over here and David's over there, and if I jump in the air, I'm not physically connected to the earth, and there's this illusion of separation, but it is indeed an illusion, and that we are all fundamentally connected. And so here we seem to go beyond education, and you're talking about dialogue, about in the very nature of reality. There's this idea about a cosmos that is like in dialogue with itself, and also I've seen you writing before about the role of dialogue in the act of creation. Like creativity is fundamentally a dialogic process, and so yes, that's what I get from a sense from reading your work over the years, is this sense of dialogue as something that is really like metaphysically deep rooted about this idea of the way in which the cosmos works in communication with itself. Am I overstating the case here, or is that
No, but I mean, I've always I feel tempted by philosophy. It's almost theology. It's not quite the right word, though, is it? It's in a big philosophy. And that's to some extent my background. I actually studied, first degree was philosophy and social anthropology, and I spent a lot of time exploring these issues. I became a religious education, partly because if you got a philosophy degree, what do you do? I thought I wasn't allowed to be an English teacher. In fact, I could have been an English teacher, which is quite fun. So I should have done that. But anyway, I was a religious education teacher. I'm interested in all these kind of issues. That is background, and you say it goes beyond education, but I rather think it's central to education. But what I was trying to say is I'm at the same time, I'm not in a philosophy department, I'm not in a religious studies department, because I'd actually quite like to be useful. I don't really appreciate all these people wittering on about metaphysics in ways that sound extremely, that involve a lot of cultural capital, shall we say, but aren't always very helpful to the world. And
Right.
so in a way, I feel what I'm trying to say is it's like a drug. It's a temptation. I want to talk about the cosmos, but I'm trying to, I honestly think that my work is empirically based and it's practical and can be used in classrooms. But nonetheless, it does have this background, and I think it's relevant. As you see what I mean? I'm always very conscious of Ricky Gervais. You remember that speech at the Golden Globes when he talked about all the celebrities? Like, yeah, we don't really want to know what you think about world politics. Stay in your lane. You're just entertainers, And I've got to be a little bit cautious about staying in my lane as an educator.
Okay. I
But
mean,
nonetheless, yeah.
yes, I am very interested in it, but I don't want to. I don't want to dwell on it too strongly. But I just think that there's something very interesting there.
Yeah. No, I wasn't trying
The
to
reason
do
that
that.
I asked it was that it strikes me as truthful and fun and really quite profound.
No,
You
I'm
know.
really glad that you connect with it, and I hope some readers will. I suppose I was just saying that I'm trying to be useful as well. But having
Yeah.
said that, I think you're absolutely right. It's cosmic, and it's very simple actually. People, as I mentioned, I mean, like I mentioned Merleau-Ponty and the present moment. If you think, it does surely make sense that you can't have a present moment unless you generate a horizon, shall we say, around experience that is, in a sense, the cosmos. The cosmos is just a Greek word meaning everything. So it doesn't necessarily, you don't have to imagine structures of planets and stars. It's just around us there has to be a horizon. If you stand up on a big moor or in a landscape, there's a horizon around you, isn't there? And actually, everything involves a kind of dialogic tension between that center and the ground. And you don't really get anything without that. So you don't have things on their own isolated. You only have this dialogic tension between a center and a horizon, if you see what I mean. Yeah, sorry, does that make sense? And so, yeah, that is the nature of the cosmos. And I'm very interested, I mean, there's fascinating work by Carlo Rovelli, for example, a leading quantum theorist, who's basically claiming that relativity is pretty common in physics, because obviously you have, things like velocity depend on the relation between the movers. But he's basically saying that all information has to be information between systems. It's relational. That seems to be what we're learning about the nature of reality. And so, in a sense, we have a tendency to imagine we can contain things as separate, isolated individuals. And we do have a tendency to teach children and young people that. So you will sometimes find, for instance, you're in a group and some adolescent is clearly under the impression that they've got nothing to do with everybody else. And it really doesn't matter if they just ignore everybody and hide behind their dark glasses. But actually, it's having a terrible influence on everybody. So we're sort of teaching people that they are. And the whole processes of education tends to encourage people into this view that they are separate individuals entirely responsible for their own stuff. But in reality, I think we're part of this vast interconnected system. And part of the role of education is to draw people away from that, in a sense, delusion that they are separate, and to realize their true nature, because that realization can be liberating and make you less depressed.
And that's one of the reasons why your book is actually genuinely useful. One is that it emphasizes that sense of connection and collectivism. Two is that it really engages with the idea of education as a collective experience. And the point I'm going to come on to about technology is interesting. We are becoming such a fragmented society, and the individual is becoming the focus of everything, politically, economically, socially, in all of these areas. And what you do extraordinarily well is establishing this idea that we need each other in education. It's not just the educator and the learner, it's the community of learning that's vitally important. And I think one of the other great strengths that you've demonstrated is it's the eclecticism that you bring to this discussion that makes the book special. You know, you throw in a passing reference to Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a young man. You draw on all sorts of sources, all sorts of references. And we need that. We need to step up, I think, in terms of the richness of educational debate and get it away from the fixation with utility and accountability that has been landed on us. I mean, I talk about the deluge of D's we've been subjected to, dogma, direction, discipline, derision as a mode of debate. There's a whole coterie of these things, and you really challenge all of that in the book, and I think it's a tremendously useful book in that regard. I think one of the other ways it threatens to be enormously useful is that you also engage with technology, and particularly with the rise of AI. There's a real, I think, modernization in your book around the arguments that you pick up, but you bring them right up to date in terms of some of the challenges of AI. So it'd be really interesting, I think, for you to say a bit more about that. Can we have a dialogue with technology, which is one of the questions you ask in the book, and how your thinking has evolved with the advent of increasingly sophisticated and individualizing technology.
Well, it's quite an interesting story if we go back to the origin story idea, because as I say, I did find myself I've always loved technology, actually. I used to, cybernetics, it's kind of interesting stuff, isn't it, in the early days? I remember as a kid, we actually had robots that could use photoelectric cells to follow lines on paths. This is back in the 1960s, 70s. Amazing. Anyway, I thought it was amazing potential. But when I was in this Institute of EdTech Center at the Open University, they were doing AI, and they thought it would be a revolution in education. This was around about 1990. And it really wasn't, because that old-fashioned AI was very much based on expert systems, lots of if-then lines, if can we fit it under this rule? If not, then that. If so, then this, and it had to be programmed by an expert, and that wasn't very responsive. Which is why I said to everybody, I'm not interested in making these supposedly smart machines. I'm going to put the intelligence in the kids. And that's exactly what we did with Neil Mercer and others. We could show that we could make the students more intelligent, because the computers clearly weren't capable of really supporting intelligent discourse. So I was a bit dismissive at that time, and I thought it was all hype. But 30 years later, with generative AI, it's based on completely different principles. It's much more dialogic. If you think about it, the meaning of a term in the large language models is based on the history of its use and its relationships. And you can measure that statistically, but it's not a dictionary definition. Exactly what Bakhtin said about meaning. So the meaning of a word in the dialogue, not something you can look up in a dictionary. It depends on the effect it has on the movement of the dialogue. And generative AI is a much better conversational partner. So although we use the term AI, we're talking about two completely different kinds of things. And I personally find that I can benefit a lot from talking to ChatGPT in my case, or Claude, or whatever chatbot they are, because they've kind of read everything. And they can really help you if you prompt them appropriately, if you stop them from just being sycophantic. And although you've been doing a lovely job of making me feel good about myself today, so it feels like having a conversation with my favorite AI. So thanks so much. But what I occasionally do is say, "Oh, go on, be brutal," Or what if I was somebody else who hates this sort of thing? What if I was Ben Williamson or Neil Selwyn? What would you say? Sorry, they're just colleagues in the ed tech field who have very different views. And it's very good at finding the criticisms, because it can bring in the different views that are going on there. Obviously, it isn't an independent consciousness. doesn't have any meaning, but it's a fantastic support for enriching learning from dialogue. And what I think is that because of the nature of the AI, we've always had this debate about the dangers of just transmitting facts and the importance of teaching children and students to think for themselves and so on. And that's always been a bit of a debate. But increasingly now, with the fact that the AI can kind of know everything and it can do anything that can be reduced to an algorithm of any sort, it's becoming increasingly apparent to people that we need to be teaching for the kind of skills, not only that the AI doesn't have, but that are effective in making the best use of AI. And I think this dialogic education, which is about teaching students to be good at asking questions, at listening, at learning from multiple perspectives, is the best way to prepare students to be effective at using AI. So I think that become very appropriate, that message. It's always been there, but people have put it to one side, and education could just carry on transmitting a load of stuff from without having to change too much. Now I think people are seeing that we need to change, and that even in order to use the AI effectively, you have to be good at asking questions, at prompting, at iteratively exploring an issue.
Let's rethink education.
Hello, everybody. I will keep this short and sweet, so no need to reach for that skip button. We love making this podcast, and with over 600,000 episodes downloaded to date, it seems like people out there are enjoying it too. In fact, we even hear from people from time to time. It is a labor of love, though, with the emphasis on both the love and the labor. Producing each episode involves reading books, carrying out the interviews, obviously editing them, paying for the increasingly bewildering array of tools that keep a show like this running. Most people don't realize, but podcasts like this rely on support from people like yourselves. Right now, we have 27 patrons who help us to keep this show going. If just 1% of our listeners joined them at patreon.com/repod, we could sustainably create even more of these amazing conversations, which I think are increasingly urgent. There are various tiers to choose from with different benefits attached to each tier, starting from as little as the price of a cup of coffee or herbal tea per month. Or if you prefer to make a one-off donation, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com/repod. Either way, if you just want to carry on listening, please feel free to do so. And thank you very much for being part of this community. Now let's get back to today's episode. Really interesting. And I think that most people are just using AI and just in the sycophantic mode. But it's like, oh, what a brilliant idea. It's like, you're a genius. And yeah, so the kinds of things that you're asking there about, talking about examples of how to get it to challenge your, what would my mortal enemy, whatever.
No, nothing wrong with Ben Williamson, Neil Selman. They're both very, very interesting, and I quote them a lot. They're very interesting. Yeah, I have a different perspective on AI, on the tech.
Mortal enemies are helpful, though, aren't they? They help to sharpen your thinking. Who was it?
Exactly.
Swift or someone who said that. Yeah, and so I don't know. Have you done much work on this, just in terms of the practical implications of this? Like, what does it look like? Like, how can we teach people, children and adults for that matter, to get better at dialoguing with AI?
Yes. Well, I'm working on that, and we have a couple of projects here. Like there's one where we're developing a moderator. The thinking together. There was usually someone in the group who took the role of moderator. We didn't impose this, although some models do that. The moderator role, where you're actually saying, "Do you agree? What do you think, Emma? You haven't said anything for a while, and can you build on?" and that sort of stuff. So we're getting an AI to do that, and it's having some quite good results, although it needs, it's challenging. So that's one where it's moderating small groups, which I think is effective. I have worked with we can use prompts that like there's the question Q reframer by Simon Buckingham Shum, which whatever you ask it, it'll always challenge your assumptions, and then you can go in more deeply into the assumptions. So that's one exercise I've done with teachers. It's actually, I mean, it's something we're developing at the moment, but it is quite possible to teach students how to question, challenge, explore alternatives. I mean, one way that's quite popular is generating a range of perspectives on any issue. So that whatever it is, so whatever you're talking about, you could generate a range of voices of stakeholders who are involved with it, but seeing it from different points of view and set up a dialogue between them. And the AI is very good at that. It's very good at kind of role play. So there are quite a few activities that we're developing and exploring. Another project worth mentioning, which I think will go places, is a dialogue coach. So it's a coach where you generate a person you're dialoguing with and a coach to give you some feedback about the quality of your dialogue, to teach people to be better at dialogue. It's actually for managers, and we're dealing with difficult people in performance reviews. But I'm hoping that it'll move into like the idea of coming up with creative decisions in boardrooms that can take things forward. So it's more general.
So you're using the AI as a dialogue coach?
Yeah. So the AI sort of splits it, generates. So we have an AI person you're dialoguing with, but also an AI coach that can kind of give you feedback and tell you how you're doing.
Maybe we should run these conversations past GPT, David, and get some feedback. All right, so I have a question. This is a curveball to end on. It's a change of direction. So I recall a conversation a few years ago. I believe we were walking through Cambridge, Rupert, and we had an interesting conversation where I think you'd just written something at the time about dialogue and democracy, and you were sort of saying that dialogue, or rather that democracy is perhaps not such a good idea in the absence of dialogue. I'm paraphrasing here, but given current trends that we sort of touched upon in this conversation around increasing polarization, the subversion of democratic systems that we're seeing around the world, increasing like tribalism and conspiracy theories and thinking and what have you. What are your thoughts on this, and how does dialogue and democracy, how do these ideas?
It sounds really interesting, and I do, in a way, if you're brought up, I was born in England, brought up in England, and we're constantly using democracy as kind of just a good thing in itself. It's clearly a bad country because they're not democratic and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Usually when people use the word, they actually mean voting. They mean how many, as if more people vote on something, therefore it's a good thing and it's true and we should do it. And you don't have to think about that for very long to realize that's not very good, really. I mean, just because, I don't know, lots of people vote for somebody who's obviously corrupt and is that a good thing? I don't think we have to accept that. Whereas in the societies that we're supposed to be against, and like theocracies, and you think, oh, that's obviously terrible, isn't it? They all have to believe in God. But what do they mean by God? They mean, let's not just vote for, see what people think. All we want is what's good, what's right, what's the right thing to do. And I can't help thinking that's a better idea. Obviously, I'm not promoting theocracy because usually the problem is knowing what would be the good decision, what would be the right thing to do. And I think the best way to find that out is through dialogue. And the reason why sensible people over the years have actually promoted democracy as if it was a good thing, people like Dewey and Habermas, people I really respect, isn't because of the voting. It's because of the dialogue, because in the democracies, you do tend to get an opportunity to discuss a range of views. You have freedom of speech, you have a bit of plurality, and that leads to better decisions. And I think that's the way forward, what I want. If it wasn't such a horrible word, I'd be promoting, instead of theocracy or democracy or whatever, I'd be promoting dialogocracy. I think we want rule by dialogue. I think we need to have procedures whereby we can make the best possible decisions for the collective by exploring the range of views, by teaching really for the kind of virtues you need to be able to recognize the common good that emerges in a shared dialogue. And so that's basically it. So I'm not that keen on democracy as it is, but rather than getting rid of democracy, I think we should ramp up the positive dialogue bit. We should go for sort of dialogic democracies. And of course, there are examples, citizens' assemblies. You remember, probably I had an interview with Audrey Tang that's on YouTube. Audrey Tang in Taiwan was very much advocate for democracy and developed online ways of really expanding and developing a capacity for large groups to think together and reach a consensus over the best way forward. And I think education's, I actually just thinking, sorry, this is the end point, but I'm elaborating on it. Actually, power does lie with education. If you're in politics, it's already too late. People have been formed. What is it? It's not just power coming out of the barrel of the gun. It has to have some legitimacy. Large numbers of people have supported in different parts of the world, corrupt bastards taking over. And presumably that's a failure of the culture. It's a failure of the education system. So if we want to improve things in the future, we have to address the collective virtues, the capacity to make decisions together in the common good. And we should be teaching that. What do you think?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's not only sound theoretical, but sound practical advice. And I will further indulge in my positive approach to your book. And I think it ties in with a lot of the current dialogue from people like George Monbiot, from Rutger Bregman, people who are saying that we need active democracy. And what we currently have, it is much more of a passive democracy where people are swayed by personalities, by key ideas, and that, well, we might as well give Farage a shot. We've tried everybody else, and that's not a democratic statement nor a democratic debate. And we have singularly failed, I think, to raise that level of discussion. So again, grateful to you for the contribution you've made to that. If I might throw in just one final question, Rupert, just to send us off and hopefully to send our listeners off. It's a complex book, and I think at times a challenging read, certainly for me. But I think it'd be interesting to know for teachers or for school leaders, what is it that you really want them to take away from the book in terms of taking education forward in schools and classrooms?
Yeah, well, the book was inspired by my feeling that a lot of people didn't seem to know what education was for. There are lots of debates, but actually it wasn't clear. Sometimes it seemed to be about competing with China or getting a job or something. And so I'd like them to think, after reading this book, if they agree with it, that the point of education is getting better at dialogue, is drawing people into dialogue so that they can ask better questions and so that they can listen more effectively, not just to the surface of what's said, but to the deeper meaning. And I think that's the aim of education, basically, should be better dialogue, more dialogue. That would be a great message. And I think it's, a practical message that you can implement in every subject area.
Thank you.
Love it. Thank you. What a perfect note to end on. So yes, Rupert, thank you hugely for your time today and for sharing your thoughts, for writing this blistering book, and for your blogs. If people haven't subscribed to Rupert on Substack, I think you might have changed your Substack title recently to being about expanding dialogue. Maybe it was always that. I only noticed the
expanding dialogic space, probably. That's what I usually say. Yes. Yeah, expanding dialogic space.
There's a very interesting recent blog where Rupert responds to a reviewer, a very positive review, which stimulated your thinking further. A beautiful example, of course, of dialogue in action. And so recommend the book. The book's now out in paperback, I believe. And so, yes, thank you very much. What a fascinating conversation.
No, a pleasure. Thanks so much for being interested and positive. And wow, it's great.
again. One's got the other by its expectations. The other is going for a submission. Hope has stoicism by the neck. Acceptance is struggling for breath. 'Cause driving has it on the ropes. What I want is being choked. My wheels being dragged through a hedge backwards. Not before it bloodied the nose of the world. Happy as it boxed the years of change. Contented, assaulted, progress with a change. May you find kindness under that stone. May the fall come early this year. That bridge is hoping should be